The fluorescent light above the registrar's desk buzzed like something slowly dying. The room smelled of old paper and recycled air. Audra Sinclair stood at the table with a pen in her hand and her eyes fixed on the line below her printed name. She had already seen the photograph-worn boots, a flannel jacket, the hands of a man who had worked with them every day of his adult life. Behind her, someone whispered. She heard the stifled sound that followed, not quite laughter, restrained into something that could still pass for polite. 7 people had gathered in that small government office who had not been invited. They had come because the spectacle of Audra Sinclair signing a marriage certificate to a plumber named Rhett Calloway was apparently worth rearranging a Tuesday morning for. She pressed the pen to paper, and then every phone in the room began to vibrate at once. One person looked down first, then another, then all of them. The whispering stopped. She watched the faces cycle through confusion, then disbelief, then something closer to alarm. The markets had moved. Whatever name had been buried for a decade had just resurfaced. Audra did not reach for her phone. She looked at the man across the table, at the steadiness of his hands, at the way he signed his name without theater, without looking up at the room. His name on the line read, Rhett Calloway. She only knew that he had decided something before he walked through that door, and had made his peace with it long before she arrived. 3 days earlier, Warren Sinclair had called his daughter into the study at the family home in Hyde Park. Not his office at the company, the study, which smelled of lemon oil and old leather and which he only used when a conversation was too serious for anywhere else. Audra had driven there from her apartment in 40 minutes, parked in the circular driveway, and told herself on the walk to the front door that it was probably about the Detroit contract. The Detroit contract had been bleeding for 2 months. It was the kind of problem that had a solution, or at least a containable failure. Warren Sinclair did not believe in preamble. He had spent 40 years building a manufacturing company on the principle that the truth delivered directly was a mercy, and he extended that mercy now with the same economy he brought to everything else. Sinclair Industrial was not simply struggling, it was collapsing. 3 consecutive supply contracts had been quietly withdrawn by partners, citing vague concerns about long-term stability. A financial backer who had committed to a bridge loan had pulled out without explanation the previous Wednesday. An internal audit that Marcus Volay had commissioned at the time it had seemed routine had introduced doubts into the board about whether the current leadership structure was adequate to the crisis. Warren did not use the word bankruptcy. He didn't need to. Audra had grown up in this company. She could read the architecture of a collapse the way other people read weather. In 6 weeks, without new capital, Sinclair Industrial would be forced into a structured liquidation. 412 people would lose their jobs. The foundation programs that her grandmother had established, workforce training, apprenticeship pipelines, the scholarship fund for the children of long-term employees, would end. The name her family had built across 3 generations in this city would belong to someone else, or to no one. There was, Warren said, one solution. He slid a single piece of paper across the desk. Rhett Calloway, 41 years old, worked as a plumber, a widower, 1 daughter, 8 years old. Audra looked at the paper for a long time. What does he want for this? Warren said a man had come forward, willing to provide full operational liquidity, not in exchange for equity, not on a repayment schedule with interest, not through any conventional credit structure. In exchange for a marriage, Audra asked who had approached whom. Warren did not answer that directly. She asked whether the man knew who she was. Warren said he knew enough. She asked what that meant. Warren said it meant he had agreed. I want to meet him first, she said the following morning, when she called her father from the parking structure outside her office building. She had sat in her car for 40 minutes the night before, without going inside, doing the other kind of math, the kind where you count the things that cannot be recovered and weigh them against the things that can. He said that isn't necessary, Warren told her. She sat with that for a moment. The man didn't want a preview, didn't want to negotiate, didn't want to make an impression or receive one. She thought about all the men she had encountered over the years who had wanted things from the Sinclair name, the meetings engineered to seem accidental, the favors framed as friendship, the interest that was always underneath everything, interest in something else entirely. This man, whoever he was, had declined the audition. It was, she realized, the first thing about him that she respected. Rhett Calloway drove an old pickup truck, and he was already at the registrar's office when Audra arrived with her single rolling suitcase and her aunt as witness. He didn't have flowers. He didn't have an explanation. When it was done, he took her suitcase from the sidewalk without asking and said only that it wasn't far. She followed him to the truck. He lived on Delmar Street, in the outer ring of Cincinnati's northwest suburbs, in a 1950s bungalow with a porch that sat slightly lower on the left side, and a front garden that no one had ever formally arranged wildflowers had seated themselves along the fence line in irregular rows that managed, despite their chaos, to look like they belonged exactly where they were. The front door was painted the deep green of old pine trees. Inside, the ceilings were low and the floors were original hardwood worn to a warm honey color. The kitchen had yellow walls. From a rack above the stove hung 3 copper pots in descending order of size. On the refrigerator, held in place by a magnet shaped like a small rocket ship, were drawings on white paper, and when Audra looked at them, she recognized what they were. A solar system map, rendered in wax crayon, with enough anatomical accuracy that she could identify each planet by its relative size and approximate distance from the center. Someone in this house took the solar system very seriously. The girl appeared from the hallway before Audra had finished studying the refrigerator. Dark hair, dark eyes, wearing a t-shirt printed with the outline of a constellation, Audra recognized as Orion. She was holding a book about meteorites, and she looked at Audra with the direct, unguarded assessment of a child who had not yet learned that staring was impolite. "Do you know why Pluto was reclassified?" the girl asked. Audra looked at her. "Because it doesn't have sufficient gravitational dominance to clear its orbital neighborhood." The girl Wren, Audra would learn, considered this with the seriousness of a peer reviewing a submission. Then she nodded. "Most adults say it's because it's too small. That's not the right answer." "I know," Audra said. Rhett cooked dinner without asking what she wanted. He made something with chicken and roasted vegetables and a grain she didn't recognize, and the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table while Wren explained, in careful detail, why Io was the most geologically interesting moon in the solar system. Rhett listened to his daughter the way people listen to things they have heard before and still find worth hearing. Audra ate and said very little, and watched the 2 of them together in the yellow kitchen, and tried to locate the feeling it produced in her, and couldn't. She found the email at 11:15 that night, sitting at the small desk in the guest room with her laptop open. It was from the operations director at Keller Automotive in Detroit, the same Keller Automotive that had frozen its supply contract with Sinclair Industrial 12 days ago, citing internal restructuring concerns. The email said, in effect, that Keller had decided to resume its supply relationship with Sinclair Industrial, effective immediately. The reason given was that a third party had provided sufficient short-term credit assurance to satisfy their risk committee. No name was attached to the third party. The contact address on the LLC referenced in the document's footnote was a post office box in Cincinnati, Ohio. Audra read the email twice. Then she set the laptop on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling for a very long time. She was not, by nature, someone who left anomalies alone. It was what had made her effective as an analyst and as an executive, the ability to sit with a set of numbers and feel, before she could articulate it precisely, that something in the structure didn't hold. She had grown up reading balance sheets the way other children read stories, and she knew the texture of a coincidence that wasn't one. In the weeks that followed, she mapped the geography of the house and its daily rhythms with careful attention. Rhett woke before 6 and was out of the house by 7:15. He worked at a plumbing shop 3 blocks east, the kind of place with a hand-lettered sign above the door and a parking lot that smelled permanently of copper pipe fittings and unheated concrete. He returned at 6 in the evening, changed out of his work clothes in the mudroom, and came to the kitchen. He cooked on the nights she hadn't, without comment and without expectation. He helped Wren with her homework at the kitchen table on Tuesdays and Thursdays, not by providing answers, but by asking questions that led Wren to find them herself. He did not ask Audra about her work. He did not ask about her family, her past, or what she wanted from any of this. One afternoon, she came home to find her Italian leather pumps, a pair she had worn to a board presentation 3 days earlier, and badly scuffed on the left heel, catching a curb sitting neatly by the door. She picked them up. The scuff was gone. The leather had been conditioned and buffed back to its original finish. She set them down and looked at them for a moment, then set her bag on the counter and said nothing at dinner, and Rhett did not bring it up, because he never brought things up. She found it more unsettling, in its own way, than hostility would have been. One afternoon, she was on a call reviewing the debt structure of a supplier partnership, a real estate investment trust leveraged in a way that made her uneasy. When the call ended, she turned around to find Rhett rinsing a glass at the kitchen sink. The covenant ratio they're reporting doesn't reconcile with their adjusted EBITDA, he said without turning around. Check footnote 14. She looked at him. He set the glass on the drying rack and dried his hands. Where did you learn about covenant ratios? She asked. Read about it somewhere, he said, and left the kitchen. She opened footnote 14. He was right. A week later, she heard him on the phone in the garage. The door pulled almost but not quite shut. His voice was different, not louder, not harder, but with a precision and authority that belonged to a different register than anything she had heard from him over dinner or in the hallway. Singapore position, hold it. Don't move until I say so. Drennan is setting bait. Don't bite. Call me when it moves. A pause. I won't be reachable. They know why. He ended the call. When he came through the back door 40 seconds later, he was the same man he always was, quiet, measured, with the unhurried movements of someone who had nothing to conceal. That evening at dinner, Wren set down her fork and looked at Audra. The observatory does public nights on Saturdays, she said. Dad takes me sometimes. Do you want to come? Audra glanced at Rhett. He was watching her with the patient attention of someone waiting to hear an answer he had decided not to predict. When is the next one? Audra asked. Saturday, Rhett said. It was the first thing they had planned together that neither of them had been required to plan. What Marcus Vole did was surgical, and it was timed precisely. Audra learned about it on a Thursday morning when her phone began ringing before 7. By 8, she understood the full shape of it. Marcus had spent the previous 6 weeks quietly cultivating the 4 most risk-averse members of the Sinclair Industrial Board, presenting the marriage arrangement not as the company-saving measure it was, but as evidence of Warren Sinclair's deteriorating judgment and Audra's compromised position. He had commissioned a second internal assessment, separate from the one she knew about, and used its findings to argue that Audra's personal circumstances represented a material conflict of interest in her role as chief operating officer. That morning, he called an emergency board session and moved to transfer interim executive authority to a temporary oversight committee. 4 of 7 board members voted in favor. Audra had 48 hours to file a formal response before the motion could be acted upon. She drove home in silence with the radio off and parked in front of the green door and sat in the car for 10 minutes with the engine running, then turned it off. The street was quiet. A dog was barking somewhere 2 blocks over. Wren was already in bed. The house was dark except for the light bleeding from the garage. Rhett was still working on something, which was his habit on evenings when Wren was asleep early and the house fell quiet. Audra got out of the car and sat down on the front steps without going inside. After 15 minutes, the garage light clicked off. She heard the door. Rhett came around the side of the house and sat down on the step beside her, without asking why she was there or whether she wanted company. He looked out at the quiet street. A car passed. The neighbor's wind chimes moved faintly in the dark. She told him everything. She told him about Marcus and the board vote in the 48 hours, and about the feeling she had carried all day of the floor, shifting under her feet, not dramatically, not with any particular noise, just a slow and continuous give that she could feel but could not quite name. She told him about the 3 years she had spent rebuilding the company's operational structure from the inside, the contracts she had renegotiated, the suppliers she had brought back into alignment, the employees whose names she had made it her personal business to learn. She told him she had not done any of it to hand it to Marcus Vole on the back of a procedural motion. Rhett listened without interruption. When she stopped talking, he was quiet for a long moment. A second car passed. Somewhere on the street, a porch light clicked on. He had not looked at his phone since he sat down, had not looked at anything except the quiet road in front of them. Then he said, "Which minority shareholders haven't moved to his side yet?" She listed 3 names. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was filing something carefully away. He didn't tell her it would be fine. He didn't offer reassurance or prediction. He just sat there on the steps in the dark, having heard everything, and she realized that she had told a man who owed her nothing, something she had told no one else, and that she had done it not because she was desperate, but because he listened like someone who already had a plan and had been patient enough to wait for the right moment to act on it. It was a Saturday morning when she went into the garage looking for a wrench. Wren was at Cecily Oakes's house 2 doors down, waiting for a ride to the observatory. Rhett had left an hour earlier. The garage was his workspace, organized the way a person organizes things, when they know exactly where everything is and have no need to explain the system to anyone else. The workbench ran the length of the far wall, and on the corner of the workbench, where the laptop sat half open and still running on battery power, the screen had not gone to sleep. She saw the Bloomberg terminal first. 4 portfolio windows open, each tracking a different position, set not the casual investor's brokerage interface, but a professional tool with the kind of data density that assumed the user already knew what they were looking at. 12 tickers active, a watch list she recognized as Midwest Industrials and Logistics. And in the header of the primary window, a fund name, Callaway Meridian Partners. She was still looking at the screen when she heard the side door open. Rhett came in with a length of copper pipe under one arm. He looked at the screen, he looked at her. He set the pipe down on the workbench and said, with no change in his expression, "What do you need?" "What is Callaway Meridian Partners?" she asked. "It doesn't concern you," he said. The answer was as flat as a factual statement about the weather, and that flatness, she realized, was its own kind of information. She spent the next 2 hours at her desk with her analyst credentials from her years in Chicago, pulling every available thread. Callaway Meridian Partners was a limited partnership registered in Delaware, with a principal address in Cincinnati and no public-facing website, no mandatory disclosures beyond the minimum required for a private fund operating below SEC reporting thresholds. It had left footprints in 4 significant Midwest transactions over the past 6 years, each one a quiet stabilization play, a careful injection of capital into a company that was bleeding out, executed in such a way that the fund's involvement was difficult to trace without knowing precisely what to look for. She was standing on the front porch with Cecily when she asked directly. Cecily Oakes was 66, and she had the quality of a person who has witnessed enough of life's arrangements to be neither impressed nor troubled by most of them. She looked at Audra for a long moment after the question, the way a person looks when they are deciding not how much to say, but how to say a small amount well. "There are things people keep private," Cecily said finally, "not because they're ashamed of them, but because they learn something that money alone can't teach you." That evening, Audra found the article in a financial journal archive, behind a paywall she accessed with old credentials. It was from 2013, a brief account of a new private fund launched in Cincinnati with early returns that had drawn quiet attention in certain circles. The photograph was small and partially cropped. The man at the center of the frame had his face turned slightly away from the camera. She could not make out his features, but his left hand was resting flat on the table in front of him, and there at the base of his left thumb was a thickened ridge of callus, the kind that forms over years of use in the exact location and shape of the mark she had noticed on Rhett's hand. The first night she ate dinner in his kitchen. The lawyer she called on Monday morning was a woman she had worked with in Chicago, someone thorough and constitutionally incapable of leaving a corporate structure unexplored. By Tuesday afternoon, she had the answer. West Haven Holdings, a Delaware LLC registered in 2020, held 21.3% of Sinclair Industrial's outstanding shares. West Haven Holdings traced through 2 intermediate entities to a general partnership. The general partnership's managing partner was Callaway Meridian Partners. The fund's principal was Rhett Callaway. Audra sat at the kitchen table alone for a long time after she got off the phone. She looked at the solar system map on the refrigerator. She looked at the copper pots above the stove. She thought about the email from Keller Automotive, about the post office box in Cincinnati, about the Singapore position and Drennan setting bait. She thought about a man who had been a 21% shareholder in her family's company for 5 years before she had ever met him, who had entered this marriage without once telling her that he already had more legal standing in Sinclair Industrial than any member of the ComSys board who had voted against her. She thought about the way he had listened on the front steps 3 nights ago, and the way he had said which minority shareholders without hesitation, like someone who already knew all the other pieces and was simply waiting for her to confirm one more. She found him in the garage that evening, crouched beside a row of pipe fittings he was sorting by diameter. He looked up when she came in, and he did not look surprised. "West Haven Holdings," she said. He straightened up. "Yes. You've held a position in Sinclair Industrial since 2020. "Yes. Before any of this, before my father approached you, before any arrangement was made." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "Why?" she asked. "Why did you buy into a company you had no relationship with, and then agree to this marriage and not tell me any of it?" Rhett leaned against the workbench. "My father asked me to," he said. before he died. He said the Sinclair family wasn't an enemy. He said if they went under, it would be because someone was pulling at the supports from inside, not because they'd run out of worth. He asked me to make sure that didn't happen quietly. He looked at her steadily. I bought the shares to stabilize the company, not to take it from you. I don't want your chair. I've never wanted it. You could have told me, she said, from the beginning. If I had told you, he said, you would have thought I wanted something. I don't want anything from you. She looked at him for a long moment. The garage was cold and still and smelled of copper and concrete. Outside, the light was going gray. Then he crossed to the workbench and opened the laptop. There's something else, he said. Marcus Vole has been selling information to Drennan Capital for the better part of a year. I've known since last spring. I've been waiting for the right moment to move, because a half-built case does more damage than no case at all. I think that moment is now. He turned the screen toward her. I have everything we need, but I wanted you to see it before I do anything else with it, because this is your company and your call to make. She looked at the screen. 2 years of transactions, meticulously indexed, waiting. She thought about everything she still didn't know about this man, the decade he had spent invisible, the plumbing shop 3 blocks away, the daughter who knew more about the solar system than most adults knew about anything and about everything she had already observed. Then she pulled her own laptop forward and opened a blank document. She was done being the person who received information after the fact. Walk me through it, she said. He had the documentation laid out by 9 o'clock. She sat across from him at the kitchen table with her own laptop open. And for the first time since she had moved into this house, they occupied the same space without any distance between them that wasn't purely practical. He walked her through it methodically. The pattern of transactions first, organized chronologically, then the LLC structures in the Caymans and Cyprus, then the timing of Marcus's internal reports mapped against the sequence of Drennan's external moves, each one slightly too well positioned to be coincidence, each one made possible by information that could only have come from inside Sinclair Industrial's financial operations. How long have you had this? She asked. Long enough to be certain, he said. She studied the transaction ledger carefully. The outflows were clean on the surface, routed through Marcus's own consulting entity, structured as advisory fees, categorized in a way that would survive a routine audit by anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. But Rhett had cross-indexed them against the dates of Drennan's external communications and the corresponding disruptions in Sinclair's contract pipeline, and the alignment was precise enough to be intentional and damning enough to be criminal. She had spent years in financial analysis, and she recognized the architecture immediately. Someone had built this carefully over a long period of time. Marcus had not panicked into it. He had planned it from the beginning, which made it worse and also made it more provable. You could have gone to the board yourself, she said, months ago. You had enough then. He looked at her steadily. Because it was your company, he said. Not mine. They worked until 3 in the morning. She watched him move through the documentation the way she moved through it, not searching for an entry point, but reading the structure the way you read a building, looking for the place where the weight was wrong. Around midnight, she got up to refill her coffee and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the dark garden and the outline of the young oak Wren had planted in the corner of the yard. She stood there for a minute, watching the dark yard, thinking about patience and about what it cost, about what it meant to hold something for a year and not move it until the moment was exactly right, because you understood that the moment mattered and you were willing to wait. At some point, he stood to retrieve a folder from across the room, and she looked at his hands as he leafed through it, the callus at the base of his left thumb, the article from 2013, the Bloomberg terminal in the garage, the quiet voice on the phone saying, hold the position and don't bite and I won't be reachable. He came back to the table and looked at her, looking at him. He set the folder down and said nothing and went back to work. Near 4 in the morning, Audra set her pen down and let her head drop forward. She didn't mean to fall asleep. She was aware of the kitchen going quieter, of the overhead light dimming, and then of nothing until she woke with her cheek on a printout and a jacket she didn't recognize draped across her shoulders. The jacket smelled of sawdust and something mechanical, faintly. She lifted her head and looked at the clock on the stove. 4:47. Rhett was still at the other end of the table, working. The only sound in the house, the low, steady rhythm of his typing, unhurried, in the dark. Marcus Vole walked into the board meeting the following Tuesday morning with the settled confidence of a man who believed the outcome was already written. He wore a dark suit and sat at the head of the table and looked at Audra with an expression that was not quite contempt, but was its neighbor. Around the table, 7 faces arranged themselves in the careful neutrality of people waiting to see which direction the room would move before they committed to a direction of their own. Audra stood up. She presented the documentation in segments. The transaction records first, organized chronologically, then the LLC filings cross-referenced against Drennan Capital's known acquisition timeline. She walked the board through the internal communications emails routed through a personal account Marcus had apparently believed was isolated from the company's servers. Recovered through a forensic audit she had commissioned independently. She spoke without notes, which she had always been able to do when the material was clear, and the material was very clear. 4 of the 7 board members who had voted to suspend her authority 3 days ago were now looking at the table in front of them rather than at Marcus. Marcus said it was fabricated. He said it was a retaliatory action by a compromised officer who had a personal and financial motive to deflect from her own failures of leadership. His voice held steady. His expression held steady. She could see that he had built his defense around the assumption that whatever she produced could be disputed on grounds of origin or motivation, that the room would find its way back to doubt. Audra opened the laptop. The video was 90 seconds long, taken by the security camera in the lobby of the Beaumont Hotel in Chicago on the 14th of January. It showed Marcus Vole sitting across a table from 2 men who were employees of Drennan Capital's acquisitions division, both identifiable by name in Drennan's public filings. The recording was obtained through a subpoena supported by the forensic audit. It was entirely legal. There was no audio, but there didn't need to be. The vote was 6-1 in favor of retaining Audra Sinclair in her position. Marcus Vole was suspended immediately, pending the outcome of a referral to the SEC and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. In the hallway afterward, her father found her. Warren Sinclair reached out and shook her hand. He didn't say anything. She looked at him and saw, for the first time in her memory, that he looked tired, not the ordinary tired of a difficult week, but the tired of a structure that had been holding itself together for longer than it should have, and had finally been allowed to rest. She walked out to the parking structure. The afternoon was cold and gray in the way of March in Cincinnati. Rhett's truck was parked 3 spaces from the stairwell. He was leaning against the driver's side door, hands in his jacket pockets, not looking at his phone, not doing anything in particular. He had not been called. No one had texted him the meeting time or the location. He was just there. She stood still for a moment and looked at him across the width of the parking structure and thought about everything he had done that she hadn't known about the shares held for 5 years, the contract quietly backstopped in Detroit, the evidence assembled over the course of a year and waited on until the precise right moment. None of it performed. None of it announced. She walked toward him. He pushed off from the truck. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. Cecily told her the rest of it over coffee on a Wednesday morning when Wren was at school and Rhett was at work. She told it without editorializing, which was the only way Cecily told anything, as though the facts, arranged correctly, spoke adequately for themselves. Rhett had founded Callaway Meridian Partners at 29, 2 years after leaving a position at a financial firm in New York, where he had spent 3 years learning that the industry's primary product was not returns, but relationships, specifically the management of people's belief that they were understood and valued, in service of outcomes that had nothing to do with either. He had come back to Cincinnati because he knew it, and because Wren had just been born, and because his wife had died 12 hours after delivery from a hemorrhage that no one had predicted and no one could have stopped. He had come back because the only things he trusted, after all of it, were small and specific and real. He chose plumbing because it had the quality he valued most. A problem either was solved or it wasn't. There was no version of a leak that looked fixed from one angle and wasn't. He ran Callaway Meridian quietly, at a distance, through people he trusted and structures that required no public face. He kept Wren away from it because he had grown up watching what happened to children who understood from an early age exactly what they were worth in material terms, and he had decided she would not have that knowledge until she had enough of everything else to carry it properly. "He's not living like this because he has no options," Cecily said, cradling her mug with both hands. "He's living like this because it's the only life he knows how to trust." Audra found him in the garage that evening, disassembling a valve fitting that had stopped working. He didn't look up when she came in, but he didn't keep working either. He paused, hands still, waiting. "Why did you agree to the marriage?" she asked. He set the fitting down. My father left something unfinished. He asked me to look after the Sinclair company if it came to that. And then they gave me a file. He turned to face her. Not a corporate file. A list. 412 names: workers, shift supervisors, quality control staff, and what they made per year, and how long they'd been there. And an interview, a piece from 2019, when you'd just taken the COO role. They asked you what mattered most to you in that position. He stopped. I remember that interview, she said. You said the people on the production floor should know their leadership by name, not by title, by name. He looked at her. I read that 3 times. Audra stood in the doorway of the garage with her hands in her coat pockets and the evening coming in cold behind her. She was quiet for long enough that the silence settled into something that was not uncomfortable. Ren asked me something last night, she said finally. She wanted to know if starlight keeps traveling after the star dies. Rhett waited. I told her yes, that the light keeps going, that it's already on its way and nothing stops it. She looked at him. She said that meant nothing that's lost is really lost, just still arriving somewhere. Rhett did not answer immediately. He looked at her in the thin light of the garage, with the copper pipe and the copper fittings and the laptop in the corner, and whatever was behind his eyes was not small. He did not turn back to the valve. 8 weeks after the board meeting, Marcus Valle was formally charged by the SEC with securities fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Drennan Capital issued a statement withdrawing from all transactions related to Sinclair Industrial and declined further comment. The criminal referral was pending review by the federal prosecutor's office in the Northern District of Ohio. Sinclair Industrial signed a revised supply agreement with Keller Automotive in Detroit, new terms, better margins, a 5-year commitment with renewal options. Audra consolidated her position on the board, acquiring Marcus's former share block through an independent trust and restructuring the governance protocols to require a supermajority for future executive reviews. Warren Sinclair began what he described as a gradual transition away from day-to-day operations. He came into the office on Tuesdays now. Rhett did not sell his shares. Audra did not ask him to. They both understood what the shares meant, now not leverage, not strategy, but a commitment made to a dead man on behalf of a company the dead man believed was worth keeping. The marriage was eligible for dissolution as of week 5. Neither of them mentioned it. In April, Ren planted a young oak in the back garden and announced at breakfast that she had named it Copernicus. Rhett said that was not a name for a tree. Ren spent 12 minutes explaining why Copernicus was not only appropriate, but the only correct name for a tree that would live long enough to outlast most of the things currently in the yard. Rhett listened to all 12 minutes without interrupting. Then he said, "All right." Audra was standing in the kitchen doorway watching this, and she did not try to identify what she was feeling, because she was learning that some things don't need a name to be real. On a Thursday evening in May, Ren went to a public night at the observatory with her school, and the house was quiet in the way houses are when the person who fills them most completely is temporarily elsewhere. Rhett and Audra sat on the front porch in the last of the evening light. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a lawnmower had recently stopped. After a while, Rhett said, "Do you want to stay?" He did not mean in the chair or on the porch. He meant the thing that did not have a tidy contractual definition, the thing that had been building in this space between them across weeks of shared dinners and late nights and mornings when the coffee was already made when she came downstairs, and she had long since stopped wondering who made it. Audra looked at the kitchen window, lit from inside, and at Ren's solar system map visible through the glass, all those small, precise points of light in their appointed places, each one with a name and an orbit, and a reason for being exactly where it was. "I've never stayed anywhere longer than I had to," she said. "I know," Rhett said. They sat without speaking for another long moment, and the evening continued its slow work of becoming night, and Audra Sinclair did not stand up. Neither of them had chosen any of this, and that, in the end, was the only reason they could trust that it was real.